Mr. Chairman, my name is Chris Rager. I'm with the National Rifle Association. The NRA strongly opposes Senate File 458, and I'm going to focus my comments on two provisions of the bill, and I know there will be other folks who will fill in the gaps there. First, I'm going to start with the mental health disqualifications. The bill would strongly expand firearm prohibitions that currently apply only to people who have been committed after a judicial determination to all such persons who have been confined or hospitalized for treatment, whether or not any judicial or other official determination of their need for treatment has been made. These new disabilities would be permanent unless the person successfully petitioned for the restoration of their rights. We oppose such expansions for a number of reasons. First, they impose a retroactive prohibition on a fundamental right without any due process. A person who had sought voluntary treatment would suddenly become prohibited without any chance to challenge the determination before the fact. Second, these provisions discourage people from voluntarily seeking treatment they may need by imposing a penalty for doing so. So an individual who, for instance, may have had an eating disorder and was hospitalized for that eating disorder, under the language of this bill, no matter how many years ago that had happened, could potentially be denied the right to possess a firearm. And that would be the same for individuals who have recently served in Iraq and Afghanistan who voluntarily sought help for PTSD or other issues along those lines. So you're setting up a system where individuals have to make a determination of whether or not they get help for their conditions or they give up their right to own a firearm. And third, I think the provisions would create an unjustifiable stigma around people who seek help for mental health or substance abuse problems. The NRA doesn't object to states conforming their own mental health standards to the federal standards, which require formal and involuntary commitment or adjudication before the fact. Next, the second thing I'd like to talk about are the provisions within the bill that deal with the banning of the private sale of firearms. The bill would unnecessarily abolish private transfers of handguns and certain semi-automatic weapons and limit such transfers to federally licensed firearm dealers. This ban would, without seeking out a FFL background check, would ban the usual trades or private sales at your local gun clubs. It would ban you from selling a firearm to your long-term neighbor by the definition of relative, unless Senator Champion can correct me. There's no exception for even a spouse or an aunt, an uncle, or cousin, any people along those lines. This bill would also allow for a new tax or fee of up to $25 on any transfer that takes place. And also, almost bizarrely, it would remove the existing exemptions for background checks on antique firearms. As many of you may know, antique firearms aren't regulated by the federal government, so you can't actually run a background check on an antique firearm. But let me get down to some of the things I've heard here among other testifiers. There was a question as to why don't gun owners support what's called the so-called universal background checks or the private sales bans. And I think there's one overarching reason, and a lot of the folks just don't want their firearms tracked, taxed, or taken. And let me also address a few of the things I heard from Senator Champion and others. The comment was made that 74% of NRA members support a private sales ban. Well, I actually brought the only official poll that's been done of NRA members out there, a national poll that was done in January 2013, and actually 91% of NRA members opposed the ban on private sales.
Mr. Rager, if you'd like to submit that for the record, we'll make it a part of the committee's public record at the hearing.
I'd be happy to do that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Also, I heard the gun control supporters mention that 40% of firearms are purchased without background checks. And the study that they're referencing actually was done 2 decades ago, prior to the implementation of the federal background check system. And that study actually came out and said 36%. So that wasn't actually 40%, but the way that they arrived at that 36% number was that they inflated the statistic wrongly to include inheritances and gifting of firearms. And in reality, the number of firearms sold without a background check, studies say, is likely under 10%. So well over 85, 90+% of firearms do go through a background check. And I think I also heard someone mention that background checks have stopped 1.5 million people from purchasing a firearm in the last 14 years. Well, according to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, 94% of those initial denials were dropped after preliminary reviews. Almost all of the rest were dropped after extended review, and only 62 people, or just 0.1%, were prosecuted for attempting to purchase a firearm. I've also heard the term thrown around loophole. There is no private sales loophole. Americans have always been allowed to occasionally sell or trade firearms through private transfers in accordance with state and federal laws. Private sales are the exception and they're not the rule. It's important to note that firearm ownership is at an all-time high in America and violent crime is at an all-time low. Universal background checks aren't universal. Criminals will not submit to background checks. Only law-abiding individuals are impacted by these regulations. Not surprisingly, despite extensive research, no study has shown that expanded background checks lead to a reduction in violent crime. Universal background checks would not only be an inconvenience for some law-abiding citizens, the delays and complications could lead to increases in violent crime. You can look at the provisions in this bill and see that this is, in fact, not a universal background check because there are certain individuals that are exempted from any sort of background check. Universal background checks are unenforceable and lead to registration. The Obama administration, in a January 2013 report, admitted that the effectiveness of a universal background check depends on requiring gun registration. So the state or federal government would need a universal registration system to track the transfer of every firearm for these provisions to be effective. And I have a hard time believing that any poll that you're going to cite out there is going to show that Minnesotans support any type of full-scale universal registration scheme. Also, without a state registration scheme, as I think a few have mentioned, state authorities would be unable to determine if an individual had a background check for a particular firearm unless the firearm was used in a crime or was part of an official investigation. Let me narrow the focus for a minute to gun shows. That was also brought up as part of the proponent's testimony. Like I said, there's no private sales loophole, and there is no gun show loophole. Under current federal law, it's illegal to engage in the business of dealing in firearms without a license from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Anybody that's engaged in the business means buying and selling firearms as a regular business with the objective of profit. Violations carry a 5-year prison sentence and a $250,000 fine. So people who engage in a business without a license can be arrested and convicted of a federal felony, whether they engage in business at a gun show, or out of their home, office, or a vehicle. It's also important to know that gun shows are not the source of crime guns. A 2006 FBI study of criminals who attacked law enforcement officers found that within their sample, none of the attackers' rifles, shotguns, or handguns were obtained from gun shows or related activities. 97% of the guns in the study were obtained illegally, and the assailants interviewed had nothing but contempt for gun laws. A Bureau of Justice Statistics report on firearms use by offenders found that less than 1% of U.S. crime guns came from gun shows, with repeat offenders even less likely than first-timers to buy guns from any retail source. This 2001 study was based on interviews with 18,000 state prison inmates and is the largest such study ever conducted by the government. So where are criminals getting guns? Another Bureau of Justice Statistics survey of state prison inmates convicted of firearm crimes found that almost 80% acquired firearms from street illegal sources or friends and family. This includes theft of firearms, black market purchases of stolen firearms, and straw purchases. Also, I think it's important that we understand that it's already a felony to be engaged in the business of buying and selling firearms and ammunition without a federal firearms dealer's license. It is already a crime for a federally licensed dealer to sell without doing a background check. That's all dealers everywhere, including retail stores, gun shows, flea markets, or anywhere else. Further, it's already a felony to sell, trade, give, lend, rent, or transfer a gun to a person you know or should have known is not legally allowed to own, purchase, or possess a firearm. The penalty for selling a gun to a person who's a criminal, who's mentally ill, mentally incompetent, or an alcohol or drug abuser is a 10-year federal felony. That's now today with no changes to the law. Finally, I think it's important to mention that criminalizing private transfers through a system of so-called universal background checks would not have prevented any of the tragedies that have spurred the call for such legislation. Even if accomplished by a change to create universal registration, most criminal possession of firearms would remain outside of such a system. So I think I would leave the committee with, I think it's important that we move forward in working on real solutions, for instance, like cracking down on straw purchases and strengthening the sharing of records between the state criminal databases and the NICS background check systems. And I definitely appreciate your time. Thank you.